Connecting city parts together in the 1970s was a job not only for small streets and rails, but also for very big roads or highways with big intersections and interchanges. These projects also paved the way for proper highway networks that would eventually leave the city and connect many other cities together. So in this video, let's talk about the start of highway building in the communist Eastern Bloc countries, while in the background in our city, I will extend the previously built urban highway past the industrial zone, over the river and close to the huge new residential district under construction. We will build 4 interchanges, refurbish one very important intersection, and build a fancy new modern bridge. The first modern-looking highways started to be built long before the Second World War in various countries throughout the 1920s and 30s, with some experiments even earlier. Countries with pre-war highways included, for example, the United States, Canada, Italy, or Poland, but probably most famous is Germany. The first highway there was opened as part of the Avus racing circuit in Berlin in 1921. It's still there as part of the highway A115. Many other highways started to be planned in the 20s and opened in early 30s, but the economic crisis of the early 30s halted further progress. But then, a certain famous mustache man took power in Germany, and suddenly the highway network became one of the top construction priorities, despite this man actively slowing down its construction before he came to power. The actual reasons behind making the highways a top priority are not that obvious, since the usually mentioned motivations have some holes, according to historians. It is often said that the project created a significant number of jobs, but apparently it wasn't that significant. Next, the military reasons for moving armies and hardware around the country. That apparently also isn't that clear, as some of the highways did not have parameters for heavy cargo in terms of strength of the roads, but also too high grades. Although in the end, some of the highways were indeed used for military transfers. Overall, the motivations behind highway construction were probably a mix of all, and the projects certainly presented a very strong political tool for propaganda of the time to showcase the modern progress and wealth of the country. The German highway network had 108 kilometers by the end of 1935, but after just 3 years, it had a whopping almost 3,000 kilometer length, and almost 4,000 by the end of the Second World War. Just to put that into perspective, Germany in 2023 has around 12,000 kilometers of highways. So imagine that in 3 years, 1/4 of that length was built, while the other 3/4 were built over 8 decades. Yeah, I know, it's not the most fair comparison. It's not the same highways with the same parameters. The old ones had to be refurbished and so on and so on. But still, the construction progress in the pre-war years was insane. And what is most important here is that no other country was even close to those numbers before and during the Second World War, and actually long after the Second World War as well. The Second World War halted plans for highways in many other countries, like France or United Kingdom, but in the occupied territories, the German authorities started building more highways with the idea of incorporating them into the existing German networks. Such highways were the so-called Berlinka, the Berlin-Königsberg highway through parts of Poland, then the Sudetenland highway from Bavaria all the way to Görlitz through occupied Czechoslovakia, Wrocław to Vienna, and then fully inside Czechoslovakia, the Prague-Slovakian highway. Other connections were then only planned. Work in the occupied territories went slowly, and as the war started to develop poorly for Germany, the highway projects were abandoned, with all of the projects only partially finished. In Hungary, there were no highways yet, but plans started to emerge during the war. After the Second World War ended, many of the existing highways were in ruins, but could be relatively quickly restored. Overall, the situation in post-war Germany, East Germany now, as we focus on the Eastern Bloc only, was vastly different compared to the other countries. East Germany, of course, inherited a huge network of existing highways, but perhaps more importantly, it inherited the overall idea of equipping the population with cars. which was heavily promoted by the Mustache Man, and even though the reality was that cars were still quite rare and super expensive, the idea remained, and people wanted to continue towards car ownership. The new communist leadership couldn't, and probably even did not want to, oppose it too much, at least after the dust settled after the war, after the regime change, and official formation of the new country. So that certainly played a key role in the overall much stronger boom of car ownership in East Germany compared to the other communist countries. I talked about the actual numbers of cars in more detail in episode 66, so go check that out. Also, East Germany continued with highway network expansions in the late 50s, so again, far earlier compared to the other Eastern Bloc's countries, and it would end with almost 2,000 kilometers of highways by the end of the communist era. Poland, after the Second World War, shifted its territory more towards the west. It lost its eastern territories to the Soviet Union, but gained land in the west and southwest from Germany. And together with that, it inherited some of the original German highways. The already mentioned Berlinka in the north, with only some border parts finished, and then the much longer Silesian highway in the southwest, finished from the German border past Wrocław, and then with some unfinished or partially finished parts towards Krakow. Poland, however, did not have a strong car tradition, and the overall car boom was slower, and so was the new leadership's willingness to continue building highways. The will to build them finally arrived in the 1960s, but it wasn't until the 70s and 80s when the projects finally started. But that was already too late, as Poland was in deep economic problems by that time, so work continued very slowly. Eventually, by the end of the communist leadership in 1989, there were 366 kilometers of highways, including 133 of the original German ones. In comparison, today there are 4,887 kilometers of motorways and expressways. Czechoslovakia inherited only unfinished parts of German highways, so excavated corridors, concrete bridges, and other structures. Immediately after the war, work continued on the main backbone, the Czech-Slovak highway through the middle of the country. Several new bridges were built with very high emphasis on high quality. Some road surfaces started to be laid, but after the communist takeover, all work would be eventually stopped, as the government decided to shift resources to the forced heavy industry expansion, at the expense of pretty much everything else. The officials also doubted that car ownership will significantly rise in the future. They believed that the limited pre-war car boom would simply not repeat, as it was some capitalistic anomaly of the past. They were of course proven wrong just towards the end of the 1950s, so road engineers dusted off the already existing highway network plans, and by the late 1960s, work restarted on the Prague-Bratislava highway. Unfortunately, the previous war and post-war efforts were largely wasted. The restarted highway did mostly use the existing path, so earthwork was made easier. There were also a lot of bridges, some were even complete, but they were reworked or torn down anyway, which was later proven to be completely pointless. Plus, the existing bridges were very high quality, unlike the new ones that apparently started to have structural issues in the next decades. Some partially finished bridges, accessories or surfaces were not properly preserved in the 1940s for a restart, so decayed too much and had to be torn down as well, which was overall a huge financial waste. By 1989, there were some 600 kilometers of completed highways, with the most important one, Prague-Bratislava, done after 13 years of construction. Other highways were completed only a little bit. Czechia and Slovakia together today have just below 1,900 kilometers, so that was already a significant distance built back then. Hungarians started building highways from scratch, the first one in mid-1960s, but most highway length was built in 70s and 80s, all radiating from Budapest. And by 1989, the total length was around 350 kilometers. Today, Hungary has around 1,800. So overall, highway construction during the communist era was not done that much. East Germany is a complete outlier in here with its pre-war history, but outside of it, only the Czechoslovak Prague-Bratislava highway managed to fully connect two very large cities. Cross-border connections were also not a thing. except the Polish-German highways, but only because they were built when it was all Germany. Unlike today, people and products were not crossing borders as much, so priorities were elsewhere. Interestingly, a lot of highway projects emphasized the need to connect into the Soviet Union, but it seems from some reports that it was just a political phrase that designers used to maybe score some points for their designs, but such highways were not built. Those were highways connecting different cities, but that certainly was not the start. If you ever played City Skylines, then you must know that building a highway from outside of the map towards the city is maybe just 10% of the work. The biggest challenge is to actually distribute traffic into the city. How are you going to do that? Just end the highway into a dirt road? Well, someone certainly did that in the game, I'm sure, but in real life that would make the highway quite pointless. So it must have continued into some urban highway system, or at the very least a system of big avenues. And that loops back to the urban highway video, episode 73. So what was built first? I found a source that clearly defined 3 phases of highway construction. First phase were the urban highways or city entrances. So those would be all the big roads inside cities, big avenues that would eventually make their way towards the outskirts, where they would simply end for a while or connect to smaller existing country roads, temporarily. The second phase would be the continuation of these entrances and connecting different cities together. So throughout the communist decades, most cities experienced phase 1 and some phase 2. The last phase 3 is something that East Germany already went through, but most other countries are going through it right now, which is the formation of a unified highway grid across the whole country. Let's take a look at some examples of what I'm talking about. This is the North City in Prague and an urban highway that is the northern end of the North-South Avenue that I mentioned also in episode 73. This road was completed roughly together with the first residential estates around it with this Parklow interchange. That is also where the road ended for some 2 decades, until it was followed by the Prague-Dresden highway, built from the very late 80s to mid-2000s. So for a very long time, the road served only the inner city. Just on a side note, this actually makes sense when we look at the car ownership statistics. Mostly people living in cities owned cars and used them either for commute inside the city or occasional trip outside of the city or simply as a status symbol. Something like daily commute into the city from suburbs was not very common back in the day. That is the huge difference when we compare Central Europe 50 years ago to, for example, the United States or Europe today. That is also partially the reason why cities grew so rapidly during the communist era. If someone worked in the city, they were housed in the city as well, since industry and housing expanded not freely, but both according to the central plan. Theoretically, of course, not every place had perfect balance of jobs and housing. So the outside city connections were not particularly necessary, certainly not for the capacities we need today. So the construction phases I mentioned before made sense from this point of view. The preparation for outside connections served as a fix for inner city traffic initially and provided a convenient attachment point for the cross-country segments later. It was of course planned all together. It wasn't like, let's build random urban highway and think of its outside potential later. No. Even though we might find unfinished projects, as concepts could have changed in the meantime. We are in Pilsen, which saw major road construction in the very core of the city throughout the 70s and 80s. The big roads mostly served as car connections with the modernist expansions that were built simultaneously. But the actual outside highways arrived in the mid-90s and finished a city bypass in the mid-2000s. It is possible that because Pilsen received the outside highways rather late, it meant that it would be a bypass highway, not cutting through the city center, even though the big roads were mostly prepared for that. I already talked about some plans for Prague from the 1950s and 60s, how something like bypasses and rings were not considered back then. The concept of those arrived later. So perhaps there was some good in the late construction, as concepts could have been altered to suit the recent trends. Warsaw, Budapest or Bratislava were also similarly built in those 3 phases. In episode 73, I showed those big roads gradually built in Warsaw from right after the war. But the actual outside highways started to arrive in the 90s and 2000s, so long after the preparation inside the city was done to attach them. Obviously, before highways, there were other roads. It's not like people and goods could not travel between cities before the invention of highways, but a lot of roads were in pretty bad shape, and significant investments had to be made to make them better. Tens of thousands of kilometers of dirt and gravel roads received asphalt covers, just like old cobblestone roads, although inside cities we can still see pictures of cobblestone even on very big roads. Other major roads received huge refurbishments, but especially small towns and cities suffered when those major roads went through them. That is still a big issue today, and work continues to provide bypass roads, other than highways. But on the other hand, a lot of roads remained in bad shapes and did not receive enough attention, which is also a never-ending problem still today. Let's now talk about the build here in the city. So right now in the time-lapse, I'm building that second interchange of today, but let's first talk about the first one that you could have seen me already complete here in the time-lapse. So the first one was not particularly big, but it was part of a major refurbishment of that very important junction at the train crossing in front of the new hospital. That road is the only road connection into that new residential district, and it was not keeping up at all with all the traffic, all the bus traffic as well, so there was something that I had to do with it. Now, it was clear that it's mostly because of that level train crossing, why the road is not keeping up with the volumes of car traffic. So I had to make it separated, but at the same time, I needed to introduce trams because that road is also going to see trams. I already established them in the new district, and it was clear that it's going to be an extension of the tram line that right now ended at that old train station in that area next to the hospital. So that was kind of a challenge because the area is not really big, so I had to just squeeze all of those networks in there. And then I figured, by the way, when I was first building for this episode, I was thinking it's going to be like a public transport episode or more like a tram episode, and I'm just going to more focus on the tram line going into that new district. But when I was doing that refurbishment of that intersection, I was thinking, well, it's kind of going to be a big intersection. Maybe it could be connected somehow with some sort of a road into the highway network. Okay, but if it's going to be connected to the highway network, then, well, I kind of need to establish the highway network, right? Because it needs to connect somewhere. Right, fine. So I'm just going to, move it to some kind of interchange somewhere in the open, and I'm just going to do the highways later. Yeah, that's going to be fine. Well, not really, because I already need to know where are all the highways going to go towards there. So I kind of need to extend this urban highway, and well, it might be actually best to just build the highways first completely in this area of the city. So, well, here we are. It was supposed to be a tram video, but it's a highway video. And I'm just building 4 interchanges in this project. But anyway, so that was the major refurbishment of that junction. I just connected it to some sort of a smaller highway. It's maybe not really a highway, it's just like a big road, big surface road that went under all those train tracks in there as well. And it's just going to go somewhere in the open, and we are going to connect it to this network last today, okay? So then I moved towards this industrial zone because right there were kind of like a slum area from the 1930s or something. It was heavily damaged during the war as part of the entire damage to the industrial area, but it was never rebuilt because maybe engineers already had plans for some kind of traffic solution in that place. So that's exactly where I built that second interchange, the biggest one for today. So it truly is a big one, and it needs to be because it's going to be the main entrance into that industrial area and, well, the rest of the city, of course, through the urban highway network. Now, it's also going to be a very important road connection for buses from that new residential area just across the river into the industrial zone, because all the workers are obviously well, they need to get there somehow. And before the highways, they couldn't really. They had to go through the rest of the city. Even like gameplay-wise, they had to go through the rest of the city. For example, using the trains, going into the main train station, and then boarding the trams and kind of circling back into the industrial zone. So that was not exactly convenient. Even if I did make like a direct bus line, it would also have to like circle around. But right now, when the highways are there, when I'm later gonna finish the bridge over the river, then that's gonna be so much more convenient. Right, so that was that very big interchange right there. It was kind of difficult to put that one together because of all the grades, so I had to make it somewhat large because I needed to make a new bridge over the river, but there was no space for that because we have all of those railway viaducts in there, and they're kind of blocking the way. So I had to make the highway above that. I was looking at some real-life inspiration for some bridges, especially like how tall I can build them realistically, and it was okay to actually put it over the viaduct. At first I was thinking I'm actually going to demolish the viaduct, or at least like partially, and replace it with some concrete bridge that's absolutely not fitting with the rest of the arches, stone arches. But it was not necessary. We can just put it over it and it's fine. But that meant that the highway was very tall, and the interchange, well, all the ramps and everything, they had to go to the ground. So there were quite significant grades. That's why the interchange needs to be somewhat big. I really wanted to have it more or less full, even though I omitted one direction. You could have seen that in that sketch that I was doing in MS Paint. But otherwise, I just did all the loops and everything, also to gather the elevation and not have like stupidly unrealistic grades and all of that. So eventually the interchange turned out quite big, but you know, it's performing. It's something that this city part definitely needed. Unfortunately, while building all of these highways, I kind of introduced a lot more traffic around the interchange on the streets down below, and those streets are now not keeping up. It's kind of strange, right? I mean, I added more lanes and now I have worse traffic. It's kind of strange how that works. I'm not really sure. But anyway, that was that. Now, we are going to move further towards the urban highway network from before, and I'm going to just wrap up this small interchange. It's kind of just like a highway exit onto the streets, nothing more, but it's in a trench, as you can see. It kind of requires some detailing around it to make it look good, and well, it also is part of one very important change, and that is the trams. I did the tram ride video previously, and right in the previous episode, right? Yeah. And at first I wanted to do it from the racing circuit, not from the depot. But then I figured, well, the racing circuit is actually not all that interesting to look at from the perspective of the trams. There's literally nothing around there. So I decided that that's actually going to be the tram track that we're going to get rid of completely. There were a lot of tram tracks that were just deleted, you know, in the second half of the 20th century. So that's kind of realistic. I don't really want to go into that many details. I'm going to talk about public transport in some other videos, but that's just going to be the tram track that we're going to get completely rid of. It was supposed to go on that road over that interchange. So already there, I just got rid of the tracks on the newly established bridge, and the tracks are kind of on the side streets still before they will eventually be completely removed. But I'm just going to do that sometime later. Right now, I really wanted to focus only on the highways. So that was just the completion of that interchange, that kind of highway exit. Now I'm going to move past the new bridge, which I'm actually going to build last, it seems, and I'm going to finish up the fourth interchange. This interchange is going to connect into that smaller highway-ish road that goes from the first project from today, and it's just going to connect to the main highway that goes across the river into the second and third interchanges into the urban highway. So in here, I did not really need to create some kind of monstrosity. Even though I have lots of space, there's nothing around here. It's completely green field, but yeah, I really don't need to build anything massive, and I really don't want to, because if I don't need that volume, I really don't want to build huge interchanges, because they just don't look good when they are everywhere inside the city. That's kind of my advice to you if you are building, some sort of highway network in city skylines. Just build it, so it fits the situation. It just looks so much better at that point. But anyway, so I decided that I'm just going to build a simple park law in here, 2-quadrant park law, and I just made it relatively quickly. Unfortunately, I'm using the roads that I prepared for the urban highway. I don't have like a 3+2 version, and when I was just building this, I thought, come on, I just don't want to, switch the mods and just load into the editor and just build the road and then load back into Altengrad. Let's just build it like this. So this interchange actually is not going to have like turning lanes and merging lanes. It's kind of realistic. Well, I mean, not really, but there are some of these points, for example, in Bratislava, actually on the side of the bridge that I'm taking inspiration from later, there are also these kinds of like leaving ramps that don't have like a prior separate lane. It's kind of dangerous, obviously, especially for the merging lanes, of course, if they are not there. But it's not really like a highway. It's more just like a big separate road. So I guess it's okay. It probably would be better, obviously, if there were the lanes and all of that. But I just did not have the road, okay? I really did not want to make it because I would have to go through all the loading and everything again. So yeah, this will have to do. And City Skylines obviously doesn't really care. And it's one of those interchanges that are kind of outside of everything, it's just on the green field. So it's okay. It's absolutely fine. Now, we are going to do the structure of that bridge. And when I'm going to start building this, you are immediately going to notice that I took heavy inspiration from the Slovak National Uprising Bridge in Bratislava. So that bridge was completed in the early 70s. It was part of the main highway, urban highway connection to Petržalka, to the new district, the new housing district. So that's kind of something we are having here as well. Although the bridge is kind of unfortunately positioned in Altengrad, so it's out of the way of the main city. In Bratislava, it's kind of in the center, really. You can definitely see it from the center, and from the viewing platform of the bridge, see the center of the city as well, all the landmarks and everything. So we don't really have that over here. So that's why I decided that I'm going to omit that UFO on the top. I'm just going to do the structure because I was actually positioning the camera on top of the pylon and just looking around the city, and the view is just not really all that great from here. So yeah, I'm just going to have the bridge like this and be done with it. As you can see from the time-lapse, I really made it super quickly. It's really just 3 procedural objects forming the main structure. Then I'm just using these cables, the cable networks that are specifically intended for custom bridge making. And well, then I just stretched them over the highway. I was looking at the blueprints of the Bratislava bridge to actually kind of have the dimensions quite similar, even though there are some differences, but it's very, very similar. And by the way, the real-life bridge is almost looking a little uncanny because these cables they're not going. There are 3 of them, or 3 strands, let's say, but they are not dividing the bridge into 4 same quarters, right? But they are actually much closer to the pylon, and then there is the largest span opposite of the pylon, and it's very long actually. It almost looks like it's impossible for the bridge to just hold like that, but it does. It's just a showcase of how the engineers of the time were they really knew what they were doing, and the bridge is certainly a technical marvel, no doubt about that. So I just wanted to replicate something similar over here, especially because there is that very old truss bridge, railway bridge right next to this. So there's like a beautiful contrast of the very old and the very, very new. And the new one, of course, is like nice and shiny. You can definitely see it, notice it right away. Now, right now, behind this bridge, as you can see, there's not much there apart from the interchange, but that will change. Not exactly maybe in the communist times, maybe in the 2000s, 2010s, or even later. I am going to expand the city in there and just make the bridge part of some kind of city expansion, so it's not completely alone right there, as you can see in this before and after transition. Right, so in that first transition, you could have seen the huge change in the traffic situation. Yeah, look at that. The traffic is now flowing almost freely around here. It's not a perfect interchange. There are some left turns, but I just figured I don't really want to make it overly complicated. I would have to demolish many more houses around here and just make it look kind of strange. So this is working perfectly fine. There are traffic lights on the main crossing down below, and it's just working. It's just performing exactly how I need it to. It's not going to remain the only entrance into that new district. There will be many more, so that will alleviate traffic from that junction even further in the future, so that's going to be fine. Now, of course, this highway is eventually going to circle around that new residential district, and it will connect to it at many more points. That's also where I would like to do some kind of a bus line, direct bus line from that district into this industrial zone that will soon come into view in this particular shot. Yeah, the bridge. The bridge is just looking great. It's one of the few bridges over rivers in Altengrad, so it's very important. As you can see already, there is some significant traffic over it gameplay-wise, even though the highway is actually not connected on both ends to anywhere, really. So it's just connecting the inner city, well, just like in real life, just like I showed you, for example, in Prague, how these kinds of roads were first made to just fix the traffic inside the city, and later they connected to the outside highways. This particular shot just, showing you the horizon there that's formed by all the concrete towers, and there are obviously going to be many more. So this particular view is going to change quite a lot. Now, also underneath this particular interchange, there's not much there. I just put some decals there to make it look a little dirty and something. But yeah, I'm going to probably put some trees there, or just maybe detail it with some more garbage. Now that I'm thinking of it, maybe I could have just put a parking lot below there. That's kind of realistic, but who knows? I do have some plans for this area to change in the future, so maybe I don't want to detail it too much because I would have to just delete it quite soon-ish. Anyway, now we are seeing that another interchange, well, a small one, an exit really. It's in this trench. It saw extensive demolitions of this city part because there were building blocks in its path, but well, that's all in the past. No one's gonna remember that. And now we are just going to pan to see the rest of the urban highways right now as they are kind of just ending in the city on the opposite end. On the opposite end, there will have to be another bridge over the river and, well, maybe some more connections to different kinds of highways, but I don't want to spoil anything, but I do have it planned already. Now, just in detail, this one, I did some intersection marking tools here and there, of course. Traffic manager heavily applied on these, and all these different things, all these different fixes, nothing all that fancy. Anyway, that is going to be all for today from Altengrad. In the next episode, I was actually thinking of focusing on those trams. I wanted to do it today, but maybe let's do it in the next episode. I'm just going to build some trams, do some loops, extend the networks, and maybe revisit some old areas that we haven't seen in a really long time. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. Thank you for watching. Hope you liked this Altengrad episode. If you did, then please do all the clicking and writing and everything below the video. It really helps the channel, so please don't forget to do all that. And huge thanks to channel members who decided to directly support what I do here. Thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate it. Take care, and I'll see you next time.